I did a sort of back-of-the-envelope study and asked myself the question, how many workers in Idaho and surrounding states, 25 years or older, have a bachelor's degree or higher? And what I found is in Idaho, it's about 24% of the workforce has a bachelor's degree. Utah, it's about 28. Colorado, 34. And for the nation as a whole, it's about 27. So I found that in the U.S. Census Bureau data. And then I went to the U.S. Bureau of Labor and asked the question, how many of the occupations in these states require a bachelor's degree or more? And again, these are rough figures. And what we found in Idaho, about 29% of the jobs require a bachelor's degree. In Utah, 26, Colorado, 32, and in the U.S., 29. Well, you would, in a perfect world, you would kind of like the proportion of your population with a bachelor's degree to match up with the proportion of jobs in your economy that require one. Call me old-fashioned. What does it say? Idaho is running a 6 percentage point deficit in the number of people with bachelor's degrees relative to the jobs in the state that require one. Let me repeat that. Idaho is running a 6 percentage point deficit in the number of jobs that require a bachelor's degree relative to the people who have one. So what does Idaho do? I don't know, but it would be fair to guess that people are hired who do not have qualifications for the job they're in on paper and work their way into the job through experience. That's not a bad way to do it, but it's not a way to have a very high income. Why is that? Because you're not going to be brought in at the salary that the job was supposed to have initially, and you'll always be behind the 8 ball as you're learning the job through time, so you'll never catch up. Then there's always the competence issue, I suppose. And you won't be as productive either because you're not coming in with the skills, you have to learn them. And that would be another rationalization for paying people in those positions low wages. And so you can see, it seems to me, you can see that Idaho has a structural education problem of not having enough educated workforce for the jobs that it has that requires one. As opposed to Utah, which has 2 percentage points more people educated than the jobs that are available. So there's underemployment there. This is where the classic example is New York City, where you have PhDs driving cab. And Colorado has a 3 percentage point more people educated than is required. And the U.S. itself is actually running a 2 percentage point deficit. The nation's in trouble on this very score. Okay, this is revealing to me and suggestive. Let's see what the implications for this are relative to wages in these three. The green line is using skilled and less skilled labor to produce all the output in the state of Idaho. And you're using more skilled and less skilled labor in some combination. You don't want all of your workforce to have a PhD, and you don't want all of your workforce to be elementary school graduates. You want some combination. That's best. And if you get out of whack, then you're going to be one of the red lines in producing things, which means you can produce less than if you have the right combination, the green line. And the black line is essentially a measure of your average wages. If you have skilled and unskilled in the right combination, you will have the highest average wage you can have in the state. If you have too many of one or the other, then that black line will shift towards the origin and your average wages will be less. But if you can stay on the relationship of the black and the green line, tangent to each other, and then move along the arrow line, then that will be the path of highest growth of increasing wages. Okay, this is how I think about it. This is kitchen table economics. When I'm sitting around my kitchen table, this is how I think about it. Okay? So let's look at the wages. We've looked at education. We've looked at the theory of those lines, green lines, red lines, black lines, and all of that. Well, let's look at the numbers. Idaho's average wage in 2004 was what, about $30,000, where in the nation it was about $39,000. So we were running, what, about a $9,500 deficit. 28% of the nation, and we were 47th in the nation in average wages. Okay, not great, but we could have improved over time, right? So let's jump ahead to 2010. our average wage actually did get up to $39,000. But in the meantime, the nation had moved up to $52,000. And so now we're running a $12,000 average wage deficit. Now, this is average wage for every worker in the state of Idaho on average, and we have about 650,000 workers in the state. So that's about $6.5 billion in lost wages because of our low average wage. That's a lot of do-re-mi, if you ask me. And so I've heard that we're now 50th or something in the nation. My numbers, I have 48, but thank God for Alabama and Mississippi, I say. It's very Arkansas, I don't know. It's very often said, well, in Idaho, we have a low standard of living. I mean, things are inexpensive. So we can eat the scenery, and so our real wages are actually higher. But if you look on the Idaho CPIU and US CPIU are exactly the same, and they're exactly the same because the Idaho Department of Labor says that the inflation rate in Idaho is the same as the nation. That's what they say on their website. They don't think it's lower. They think it's the same. Well, if it's the same, then this $12,000 per year per worker deficit in wages is real. It's not, it isn't that you can buy housing cheaper or clothes cheaper or food or anything else cheaper here. It's the same, essentially. And I'm from Vermont, so as I like to say, being in Idaho is almost like being in the United States. Well, that's what they're saying. It's almost like being in the United States. It's exactly like being in the United States. Okay. So why are our wages low? Why are our average wages low? Well, statistically, there are really only two ways wages can be low. Either we have a lot of low-wage jobs, because not all sectors pay the same. You can see at the, maybe you can't see, the top is food services. So if you're a waitress, you can't expect to make, $60,000, $80,000. That category of services doesn't provide a very high wage. And at the bottom, you have professional, scientific, and technical or something like that, and they have, on average, very high wage jobs. So if we have a lot of wage jobs at the top of this, proportional to the bottom, then we're going to have low average wages because we have a lot of low wage jobs. That's a jobs problem. On the other hand, maybe the array of jobs in the state is essentially the same as the nation. It's just that we pay less, so we have low pay. Every sector just pays less than the nation. So that's why our pay is low. Or some combination of low-wage jobs and low pay. So that's the question I'm asking myself, and that's the one I addressed last year to talk about. If you look sector by sector in Idaho, how much lower are wages in Idaho relative to the nation in the most important sectors by level of employment? And you can see that in general merchandising, which is essentially Walmart, that the people who work at Walmart are essentially paid at the national average wage within shooting distance. The problem is the national average wage for working at Walmart is low. So the good news is we're very close to the national average. The bad news is these are low-paying jobs. On the other hand, let's go down to professional, scientific, and technical services. We pay, these are very high-paying jobs, typically, but we pay about $21,000 less per professional worker in the state. This is a huge gap. So this is, we do not pay anywhere near. And in fact, if you listened into the presentation that was here before I started, they were talking about this for state workers, how much lower state worker pay is relative to their colleagues around the nation. So this is just verification. So it's like 32% lower than the nation. So we have, in a sense, our low-paying jobs are at the national average. Our high-paying jobs are much below. So that's not looking too good. Just FYI, remember, if we say we're about $10,000 per job less in Idaho, and that's being charitable, for the 650,000 jobs we have in the state, then we're losing about $6.5 billion. I mentioned that. And about 10% of that goes to state and local taxes. That would have generated $650 million. Well, we're only $450 million in the hole. If we had the nationwide average wages, we would be back on the growth path. We could fund services in this state at the level that we have done historically. Not extravagant. Idaho's not extravagant, but very solid. And it kept up with our growth in population, labor force, that sort of thing, inflation. But we're not, and we don't.